Right, Steve, Ian, are you good to go?
We're good.
Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our WorkBuzz webinar. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about our hot off the press, latest research, the state of employee engagement. Now, we should have been presenting this on the 5th of October live, literally hot off the press, but due to the train strikes, we unfortunately had to cancel WorkBuzz Live, but not cancel it, just rearrange the dates. So you still have the opportunity to join us. So if you're free and you can join in person or online, we've got a rearranged date of WorkBuzz Live on Tuesday, the 29th of November this year at the Plasterers Hall in central London. So you can go onto our website, book your place, come and join us. We're very excited. We love being face to face and in front of you all, but we couldn't miss the opportunity to bring the research to life and give you some insights ahead of that. So I'm really excited to be joined today by Steve Frost, who is our founder and CEO at WorkBuzz, and really the energy behind everything we do here. So he keeps us on our toes, true to our vision to improve the working lives of 1 million people. And I know for Steve, when he first did this research back in 2018, it was kind of a big stake in the ground from a WorkBuzz perspective. And we're also joined by Ian Barrow, who's one of our senior EX consultants here at WorkBuzz. And what Ian doesn't know about employee research is not worth knowing. We play a little bit of survey bingo with him sometimes because he's probably run employee surveys for most companies out there. So we're really lucky to have Ian as part of our team and to bring all of his wisdom and experience to the table. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ian, who's just going to set the scene for today and just give you a little bit of background and context.
Thanks, Dawn. I just want to set a bit of context really for where we're at. We obviously ran the survey at the end of the summer, and the number of changes that are happening since then, including a new Prime Minister just today now, about half an hour ago, obviously kind of comes full circle with all the changes that's happening. But I think in terms of the workplace, there's a number of changes that have been happening for some time. So where we're at in terms of engagement and where organisations like yourselves are at in terms of engagement is really the result of many, many years of change, not just what's happened over the last 3 years of the pandemic. So we've seen, over the probably 10, 20 years, we've seen changes in the disruption of traditional sectors. So we saw the high streets being decimated in terms of large retailers disappearing. We've seen changes in the way that employees view the workplace over the last 2 years, and beyond that, where employees, and I'll mention the M word, the millennial generation, were looking for different values in their employer that align with their own. And we've seen people change in terms of what they want from work itself, not necessarily their own employer, but what they want from work in terms of how they want more participation within the workplace, how they want to be involved more in decision making. So the changes that we've seen, yes, they've happened over the last 2-3 years with pandemic, but it's actually the pandemic has accelerated a number of changes that have been happening for some time in the workplace, and both good and bad, and created new and different ways of working flexibly. And I think what we're also seeing, though, at the moment, which is critical, is that there's now around 500,000 less workers in the UK labour market than there was a few years ago. We've seen, as I said, changes through the pandemic where people have different values on what work means to them. So they took decisions around that, different perspectives of what's important, different perspective on what employers offer as well. Where more flexibility is offered in terms of the role, people are choosing that. And also, if you go back in time as well, we had the impact of Brexit, where many foreign nationals decided to return home, and also the impact of COVID and the very first lockdown, where we saw many people return to their homeland as well. So we've got around 500,000 fewer workers in the UK, and there's some sectors really suffering. So hospitality sector, in terms of bars and pubs and restaurants, hospitals and hotels and people like that, really struggling to attract people into the sector. You know, when lockdown came, it was the first sector really which was heavily shut down, and people see perhaps as risky to go back to now. We see the care sector really suffering. We see HGV drivers and people like that. A lack of people in that sector, and obviously over the summer we all saw the impact of the airline sector and the airports that were not staffed to high enough levels post-pandemic, if we are in that kind of period, and we saw that impact on customers. So the customer experience and the employee experience is really meeting head on now, and we're seeing that as an impact of the employee experience within organisations. What we're also seeing is a change in attitude to the job as well. So if you look at the different generations there on the right, you know, I'm not old enough that I'm a baby boomer, but I do fall in the Gen X category. So you know, when I guess my career kind of mirrors that really. You know, you stuck with an organisation, you worked your way through the organisation. Hopefully, you did well. You were promoted. You moved through it at a relatively kind of slow pace. But what we're finding with the younger generations now is that, one, the average time spent in a job is much less. You know, the gig economy is real for these people, and they'll spend less time in a job role. But also, they're looking for faster movement within the job. So they're looking for movement within the role at a quicker pace than perhaps some of us at my age with grey hair are perhaps wanted in the past or experienced in the past. What we're also seeing as well is the power of brand. This is an American survey, but I think it reflects that quite nicely. You know, if you ask pre-workers, if I can put it like that, the 13 to 20-year-olds, what kind of companies they'd like to work for, you know, you get the kind of usual list of Apple and Amazon and Disney and Nike and Microsoft. But actually, when you start to asking those who are work age, you know, what companies they want to work for, the list doesn't differ that much actually. And it's the power of brand. And when you see these organizations in terms of their employer brand and their advertising roles, you know, they get the best talents because people are attracted to them. They get a large number of applicants, so they can choose the best from that. And the attitudes in terms of what they're looking for in organizations is really attracted to these big brands. So important that we as organizations, assuming you don't work for one of these big brands, that we try to make ourselves attractive as possible in terms of our employer brand and what we put out there into the marketplace.
Steve, why isn't WorkBuzz on there?
On there yet. So I think in sense of US survey, majority of our clients and team are UK and European based at the moment. So maybe next year.
Next year.
Yeah.
And I think finally coming to the last couple of months really, or the last kind of 3 or 4 months, the cost of living crisis is big in the minds of everybody, I guess. So you know, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of pressures at the petrol pump, although that has eased, what we're seeing in terms of the cost of living, in terms of groceries and stuff like that increasing, what we're seeing in terms of energy, obviously, which is the big concern in terms of energy bills that we're seeing. There's a real cost of living crisis now, and it's driving organisations to think about, could we do more? So offering rewards in terms of percentages off shopping bills or payments. We saw Amazon doing that and a number of other organisations. And what it's actually creating though for us as organisations is a greater flight risk within our own company. So we will start seeing more and more employees chasing higher salaries. You know, we see that at the lower wage end of the market, where, you know, £1 more an hour, and people will jump ship for that. But we're starting to see that filter through across the workforce now, where you know, wage demands are going to increase, and if they don't get what they need, the potential is that it creates flight risk for organisations. So we saw changes in the marketplace, we saw changes in the economy, we saw changes in terms of the number of people available for work, and with 1.2 million vacancies, it creates this kind of time bomb, this perfect storm, if you like, that's actually gone off in terms of the economy and in terms of how people work for organisations.
I think a huge amount of change. I can't think of a time period where things have changed so much just in the space of 2 to 3 years. But I think all that change creates opportunity. Hopefully for this research, we'll show you some insights to bring those opportunities to life. And I think to the building some learning over the last couple of years, where organizations have really led from the front with COVID with authenticity. It looks like people have rebounded much faster than certain airlines, for example, that sort of made enforced pay rises and enforced pay cuts across the board that found it really difficult to recruit afterwards. So I think it does create opportunities, and I think for employers, it gives you a chance to remain that constant with employees for them during a difficult time, and to become stronger and build those deeper relationships. In terms of this research, WorkBuzz, we founded and launched WorkBuzz pretty much 4 years ago to the day. I think it was the 17th of October 2018, I think almost 4 years to the day. And we've done this research most years since. We did skip last year or 2020 because of COVID. Or HR director had a lot more on and completing one of our surveys when looking at sort of how does furlough work and all those changes that maybe involved in that. What it allows us to do is take a really data-driven view and look at the biggest challenges facing people leaders, look at how employee engagement changed over time and what the key levers are to really deliver a great employee experience. In terms of the research, we surveyed 300 people leaders, quite a diverse range of organizations, public sector, private sector, third sectors, small, large organizations, and everything in between. And we did that survey in June and July this year, so relatively timely. What we've also done, we're lucky enough at WorkBuzz to survey over 400 clients now, and that number is almost growing by the sort of almost every day at the moment. And what we're able to do is take that quantitative data and look at insights from the surveys we run for our clients and also best practice ones that we run fairly regularly, and really sort of create a compelling piece of research and some insights that hopefully you'll take away a few nuggets that allow you to help, that empower you to focus on really moving neither your own employee experience and putting HR center stage. So really excited to share the research with you. In terms of what to expect, we have published about a 30-page report on this that you can download from a website, and we'll make sure you get a copy after today. It goes into more detail. The purpose today was summarize learnings and define it into 5 key themes. We're going to first of all talk about HR's top priorities, not just around talent, recruitment, retention, but also how to move the needle on that. We're going to talk about hybrid work, and I think that nearly every organization on today's webinar, hybrid will affect you in some shape or form. Even if you're in manufacturing, you'll have some employees at head office that all of a sudden maybe getting job offers elsewhere from organizations that are all office-based and can offer hybrids. So we'll look at the biggest challenges for hybrid working and how that shifted over the last 12 months. Thirdly, we're going to talk about employee lists and best practice tips. The key thing is that's become a much more constant conversation. But all the reasons Ian spoke about, that huge amount of change has meant that's become more and more important to listen regularly to your people. Fourthly, we're going to talk about culture being your secret weapon. Ian mentioned the likes of Amazon. I think last Christmas offering sign-on bonus £3,000, and not all of us can get it in an arms race with like Amazon and get an access to the basket to pay more and more. One of the key findings in the research is the biggest lever you have is your culture, the way you can build that internally, and also the way you can lead with that from your employer brand on social media to really become a compelling place to work. And then finally, with that leadership for a new era, really driven by those changes to how we work, and look at some concepts that really allow leaders to be effective in 2022 and beyond. We'll come on to those 5 factors in the next few minutes.
What we thought we'd start with, though, is a quick poll. So you might have taken part in the research anyway, but we like to keep you involved in webinars, otherwise they can get a bit staid. So here we go. I'm going to make a poll live, and we're going to ask the question, what is your top HR priority right now? So here we go. This is when we hope that the research matches ours.
I think it's one of the few polls I've seen over the last few weeks which doesn't contain the words fixed rate mortgage or the Prime Minister. One of the few polls doesn't have either of those at the moment.
Brilliant. We'll give it a couple more seconds and then I will end the poll and I will share the results and then we will take you into the research as well. So I'm going to end the poll now. I'm going to share the results. And can you see the results?
Yes.
So we can see that actually employee engagement and experience are top, attracting talent, retaining talent, culture. So let's see what our research told us. Oh, there you go. Absolute match.
Yeah. And I think that, well, it's heartening for one thing.
Yeah.
that we have a match, but I think it's no surprise that the top four things are, they're all interlinked in essence. Retaining talent. You can't retain talent if you don't have a good culture and ultimately a good experience as an employee, which creates engagement. So and then attracting talent. You can't attract talent without a good culture, etc., etc. So it's no surprise that we're finding those at top at present. It'll be interesting when we do this next year, how far things like well-being and reward and attracting and retaining talent move and where they move to. My feeling is we may see some shift in those top four in terms of their order in future, because that whole attraction piece is, we hear it from every single client we talk to, that's the critical issue in terms of churn, employee churn. And for some organizations we're talking to, that's way up at 70%, believe it or not, for a couple of organizations. So it's a real big issue, not just in terms of getting headcount through the door and keeping headcount, but the actual cost of recruitment is phenomenal for those organizations. I think one of the interesting ones I just want to pick up personally as well is remote and hybrid working, and we'll talk more about that in a short while. But that seems to have dropped down the list of priorities. It's number 12 on that list or something like that. So it's way down there, where in terms of priority, it's kind of dropping off the list. But in terms of challenge, have we got that right as organisations? Is hybrid working really working as effectively as we could have it? So whilst it's in importance, it's dropping down the list, still, the heap in terms of, or close to the top of the heap in terms of the importance of it, and getting it right is critical. And this makes sense, again, if we go to the next slide, Dawn, in terms of organisations, recruitment in the last 12 months, we asked, has it got harder or easier, whatever? We found that 8 in 10 organisations are finding recruitment more difficult. And as we said earlier, with 1.2 million vacancies in the UK at last count, and 500,000 less employees in the job market, the roles that people can choose from are wide and varied, and it really does make the task of finding employees who are a good fit for your organisation tricky as well. And even those that are at the 12% in the middle with no change, if they were finding it harder last time and it's not changed for them, you can imagine that 8 in 10 figure actually higher than that. It's possibly 90% of organisations finding recruitment more difficult. So it's a tough world that we live in terms of recruitment and in terms of retaining people within your organisation. And I think what that's proved, obviously, for many organisations, is that culture is your secret weapon, if you like, in terms of being a talent magnet in terms of your organisation. You've got to get that right. We've got to get the experience of the culture of working with an organisation right for the marketplace. We're seeing that both in terms of attraction and retention. And obviously in terms of that as well, you've got to do not just right for current employees and future employees, you've got to get that right for the world as well, because social media, whilst it's your friend, it's also your enemy. Get it wrong and you'll soon see Glassdoor ratings tumble. So it's really important that you focus in on that. And obviously salary, we talked earlier about, the pressures on budgets, household budgets, and salary is now second place there, around 31% of people talked about salary being one of the most important factors. And then it's a raft of other things in terms of working location, in terms of opportunities for learning development, and employers that are ethically responsible. So a whole raft of things there. I think demonstrating that kind of culture, demonstrating that it is a place, a desirable place to work, is critical, and making sure your employer brand is up to scratch is critical as well.
I think when I see that slide, what it screws me is opportunity. I think putting yourself in the shoes of a HR people director, you can't always directly influence the salary conversation. CFO's going to have a budget around that, you can champion around it, but it's going to be determined by the board. But actually, great culture we can influence. It is that lever that is so important for not just retaining talent, but attracting talent. And we held a best practice forum with some of our clients a few weeks ago. And what come out of there is more and more organizations that don't have a brand like Amazon or a Google or a Netflix, using social media authentically to get stories around their culture of real people and act as sort of that as that magnet to not just retain talent, but also attract it, and they go hand in hand. So it's a massive opportunity.
And really just summarising that, providing that storyline, that inspiring vision and purpose for current employees and future employees is really critical. So having the story around the good messages, the good things you do, the good experiences you have within the organisation is really important. As I said, social media marketing is your friend. Embrace it, make sure you do it well. But obviously, make sure the experience matches, otherwise you can fall foul of that as well. And listen to what your existing employees are telling you. We know that listening is becoming more frequent in organisations and different ways of listening as well. But using what you hear to inform strategy and initiatives is just as important. People want to be heard. People want to participate more in their organisation, in the decisions that's made within their organisation. So when you listen to your employees, make sure you act on that and use the thoughts and voices, if you like, in your key strategies and initiatives. And I think the other thing we noted earlier was the organisations have provided more flexibility and hybrid working is for the moment, I guess, here to stay. And when we actually asked for office-based employees whether they typically work, you see this mix of a spread across a piece, I guess, from 1 day in the office to 2 to 3, and you're seeing that kind of flexibility across that piece. And even a quarter of respondents said that employees have full flexibility to choose. And so we said, hybrid working is here for now, but its importance in terms of HR had dropped down that list. We highlighted that earlier. So there's still challenges, I think, around flexible and hybrid working. The challenges around that diminished human connection as employees were social animals. So that diminished human connection is really important. Presenteeism, that can be compounded at home, where people feel the need to be always on in front of a laptop or whatever it might be. There's that learning deficit. Younger people in the office, traditionally would learn from more experienced people just by watching and listening to how to do things, not necessarily, and perhaps being shown how to do things as well. And we're losing some of that kind of intuitive learning process. There's a real danger you create two-tier cultures, particularly where you've got blue collar and white collar colleagues in one organisation. And it's also about that kind of behaviours you get as well. If you think back to pre-pandemic, before we'd never heard of COVID, lots of surveys, people used to say, I stay with the organisation because of the people I work with, my colleagues, my friends. And that's what made organisations sticky for people. But if people aren't working with people now, they're only in the office 1 day a week, for example, or 2, where's that stickiness now? Why do people stay with the organisations if they're not working directly with colleagues personally day in, day out? So that stickiness is being stretched, if I can use the analogy, and it's easy for people to break that then and move on to other organisations and leave the jobs. So whilst hybrid working, we've got it cracked in the sense that we've got processes and we've got flexible working in place, there are challenges, I think, that we've got with hybrid working. And I've not mentioned communication, I've not mentioned managers managing people in different geographies, etc., etc. there are challenges that we need to keep our eye on across the whole piece around that. So I think clarity is key. Clarity is key in terms of knowing what's expected of everybody, knowing when to come in, knowing when to collaborate, knowing when that's an office role versus a role at home. But clarity is important that we establish that quite quickly. Don't confuse hybrid with flexibility. One concerned where you work and the other concerned how work's done. So, you know, if we need to collaborate and get together as a team and brainstorm, the office is definitely the place for that. So people need to come in. If you're writing a report and you need that kind of concentration time, perhaps that's a working at home task. So it's not necessarily about the job role now and that it's desk bound. It's about the type of work you're doing within your role and whether you need to work in a work location with people around you or not, as the case may be. So it's about understanding those boundaries and those guidelines around that. And if your team is coming into the workspace, you know, make it creative, make it flexible. I went to a client a couple of months ago now, and they all used to have their own desk, working a little pod, you know, with the kids' photos on the desk and then flowers and whatever else they had. They've abandoned that totally now, and it's the office is just full of round tables for 10. So you come in, you sit down, and you might not be sitting with your team. You might be sitting with somebody from accounts and somebody from new product development and somebody from marketing, and they're actually using it as a way for colleagues to collaborate, as a way for colleagues to meet different colleagues when they come into the office, and as a way just for kind of spreading the word about how different people work and the challenges each other faces. So how do you create a workplace that's comfortable? How do you create a workplace that's productive now? And how do you create something that gives you that human touch, if you like, that human connection when people are actually in the workplace?
Thank you, Ian. And I think linked to that and linked to all of the changes Ian described at the start of today's call, it's no surprise to see the trend of organizations listening to people more regularly. And what stands out for me was when we first launched this research in 2018, the majority of organizations doing the traditional annual employee engagement survey. That normally meant we spend more time planning the survey, it goes live, and it's weeks or months before any results are shared and so on. And we've seen that decline over sort of almost half in the last 3 or 4 years. And COVID accelerated the future as well as that shift to hybrid working. More and more organizations run into the quarterly and monthly pulses. The crux is trying to find the right cadence for your organization. Clearly, if you're in a business, well, I was talking to a client recently that has big bakeries and their workforce aren't digitally connected. So the idea of doing weekly pulse surveys is by no means the right answer. That kind of business is trying to find the right cadence for your organization and what managers are ready for too. Where I think this can really help is when you go through change. At WorkBuzz, we eat our own dog food or drink our own lemonade, and then we will crave it. And we use WorkBuzz to get feedback from our team quarterly. And just draw in what some of the things Ian mentioned about hybrid working, what we found was when we had, I think, was it lockdown? There's been so many lockdowns, I lost count, but one of the most recent lockdowns, I think lockdown 3 in November last year with Omicron, was our forced working from home. And we looked at people's intent to stay. And if everyone's looking, and we asked people if they were intent to stay, the reasons why. And when we work in the office a couple of days a week, which is our hybrid pattern, we had about 55-60% of the team site. One of the main reasons looking to stay was really good relationship with their colleagues. It was really interesting. After we've been away for 2 or 3 months, working purely remote, that had dropped down from sort of mid-50s down to mid-30s. A real tangible change because that lack of feeling connectedness. And we did our last poll results a few weeks ago. Engagement scores were relatively high in the mid about 92-93%. But actually, what the team were crying out for was more chances to connect with their colleagues on that emotional level and social level too. And we wouldn't have been aware of that if it wasn't listening to people on a more regular basis. So we've seen that trend, manual surveys to poll surveys continue. In terms of top tips for employee listening, really that commitment from your leadership team to really listen to the people. There's no point, no matter how good your survey, your employee listening platform is, there's no point of using it if you don't have that commitment to listen and act on their feedback. The more change there is, the more important it is to listen to your people. And what the key group for that is empowering your managers, making sure they've got access to real-time feedback and the right training support that acts on that too. And then it's trying to create those compelling the stories and reasons to stay engaged and involve people in that change journey. And that will link a bit later to some leadership competencies that Ian's going to talk about.
So we know that from the research that culture is your secret weapon, and one of our fabulous advisors at WorkBuzz, Neil Hayward, put this quote in our research: that culture is your best retention tool. So if it's so important in terms of attracting and retaining your people, and we know that regular listening is key, how do we make sure that we're actively listening, asking the right questions to help us really understand the moments that matter? Because engagement is a choice, right? So to Steve's point, all we can do is create a culture that people choose to engage with. And that's why chapter 4 in the research is purely dedicated to culture. But if you'd have been at WorkBuzz Live, or when you do come to WorkBuzz Live on the 29th of November, we were going to talk about buckets randomly, and you can always rely on me to come in and bring a bit of a random analogy to the mix. But I read a really powerful book to my kids when they were little called How Full Is Your Bucket? And I was speaking to a lovely lady called Michelle Ellsworth, who I've worked with over the years, a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the employee experience. And for some reason, this story popped into my head, because the theory goes that we all start every day with a bucket on our head, and that bucket starts full. But actually that there are things that can affect us during the day, and like, yes, when you're a child, it can be, you know, the walk to work, getting shouted at, all those kind of stuff. But at work, if you imagine kind of that Steve woke up this morning, the car wouldn't start, there was no milk in the office when he got here for that all important coffee. But then there was this beautiful recognition moment, and Steve suddenly stood there and said, "Oh my God, I feel so proud. Look at all this amazing work that people are doing." And then he got a thank you note from a new client. And the little things that are niggles empty our buckets, but all the other things that happen that are positive fill our buckets. And over time, these moments add up. And keeping it really simple, if we empty someone's bucket, they're going to leave. So why this is such a powerful analogy when we're talking about employee experience is the fact that what can we intentionally do to fill people's buckets, so that from an 80-20 perspective, the majority of experiences are positive. Because if we can build trust through those positive experiences, then when we have the more negative ones, we're coming at them from a better place. The trust is high, and we know we're going to get through them, and then we are more likely to stay. So it's a really simple analogy. And I'm a bit disappointed because Steve promised me that he would put a bucket on his head while I was telling this story. There we go.
Oh, sorry.
But in our organizations, bringing it back to culture, we can't control everything. So what can we control? And that's why it's really important to understand the moments that matter across the employee life cycle. And when you read the report, there is a section that really gets you thinking about the things that you can do at each of these touch points throughout the employee life cycle. So when you're attracting people, how are you highlighting the best of the company and its culture to attract people? We've said how difficult it is already and how many organizations are struggling with it. Do you have a strong intentional employer brand? You know, the work that you're doing around EVP. When you're recruiting, what is the current candidate experience? How do you know when someone joins, kind of what that experience has been like when they're onboarding? You know, is it meeting their expectations? Have they got the tools and equipment to do their job? And connection, Steve just touched on it massively. Our results strongly showed that connection is more important than it's ever been. That sense of belonging, that sense of connectedness with the people around us. So how do we intentionally create these moments where connection can happen? And this is the joy of technology. It can enable these things to happen. But, you know, I read a quote the other day that said, loneliness is the absence of meaningful connection. So how do we create more of that? Because what we don't want is people to be feeling that way. So we need to give them those opportunities to connect. And if we're not listening, then how do we know what matters? And then you can go through each part of this, but I'd really recommend going back to the research, having a look at this page, and just really thinking about what you're doing at the moment, because those questions are a really good prompt. So I feel as if I've gate crashed, talking about buckets, talking about moments that matter. But if culture is our secret weapon, then I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have in front of you. And I think Steve's going to share some statistics that kind of really talks to that as well.
Yeah, I think links that, Dawn, and you mentioned about so you can't drive engagement, you have to create the right culture, right people choose to be engaged. I think each part of that employee experience, you have to create compelling reasons to stay. You can't expect them to say you have to, as an employer, you have to create those compelling reasons to stay, not take that for granted. If you do that, you'll begin to win that war for talent. What we found in the research was a big growth in the number of organizations running onboarding surveys. So 4 in 10 now running onboarding surveys, and now 7 in 10 running exit surveys. We think that's mainly because that is around the talent market and have to really focus on doing everything you can to maximize retention and understand any lessons learned from regretful turnover. But it's also driven by the research we'll share in a minute. So on the next slide, really good research from Bamboo HR, and they found that 31% of people that leave an organization leave in the first 6 months. So in other words, if you can really optimize their onboard experience, so when they join, their colleagues are expecting them, they have the right kit, they're made to feel welcome, they have the right induction, you build that emotional connection too, they feel like they belong at your organization, they're much more likely to stay. If you get that wrong, they're much more likely to leave. So a really, really important time in terms of improving retention is really maximizing the employee experience during those first 6 months. Get that right, much more likely to be successful. They get it wrong, much more likely to leave. And in terms of moving forwards, most organizations then agree if you deliver a great employer on board, it's going to lead to retention. So so that have a big impact, that's 82%. So onboarding really, really important, really correlates to improving retention. But on the flip side, most organizations, 88%, don't do onboarding well. So really interesting and low-hanging fruit. Really want to improve retention, knowing that the first 6 months are really important. The chances are you've got 9 in 10 chance your organization doesn't do that particularly well around that. So how do you really improve that onboarding experience? Move on. Well, one of the tools that we use at WorkBuzz is our own platform. What we do is use our onboarding tool to get feedback from new starters. And we look at what bits of our onboarding experience, if we nail consistently, will create a great employee experience. And made it feel welcome from their team, have an induction, understanding what they do relate to the overall vision of the organization to improve working lives of 1 million people. And they were able to track pretty much in real time our onboarding experience intent to say just what we can do better around that. We're also able to look at things like the how people heard about the job. And for a lot of our clients, we found employees that heard about the job through referral are the ones most likely to stay, which makes sense. But interestingly, those that heard about their role through social media, got authentic stories on there, who also have a higher intent to stay and more pre-programmed to be a better cultural fit. Collecting this kind of data on a real-time sort of rolling basis really pushing the box seat as people leader to really look at not just your turnover risk, but also are you doing everything you can to deliver that great employee experience for your new starters. And any interventions you're putting in place to focus on, say, improving inductions, are they happening? Are they making a difference? And one of the tools that we've been using. And if you are a WorkBuzz client, you'll have access to this through a platform where you can get feedback from new starters from onboarding surveys, cultural baseline surveys through to regular poll surveys, all the way through to X on one single platform.
So I think we've heard a number of stories now, and we've told a number of stories around the need to drive culture, around the need to be aware of onboarding, around the need to give employees an experience across the whole life cycle that means something. But we need to lead that. We need to lead that not just from the top of organizations, but all the way through organizations. But what we're seeing at the moment, this is our own data from across all of our surveys, we're seeing a real change in leadership where immediate managers, i.e. people managers, seems to be getting it right. And this is what we've looked at really is across the pandemic period. So we're seeing managers getting that process right, where they're communicating, recognising, and generally managing teams well. But what we're seeing from the leadership at the top of organisations is a decreasing positivity score right away across the pandemic, really, where people are looking for leaders to lead them through tough times, looking for leaders to be more authentic and trusting through times, and really to hang on to the kind of things they were doing well in the pandemic, where we saw leaders in organisations being really authentic and really empathetic towards how people felt, and equipping people with the protective coverings and whatever else they needed in the pandemic period. So we're losing some of that in terms of how people lead organisations. What we've got to have is if you click onto the next slide, Dawn, is a new set of competencies really for leaders, and not just at the top of organisations, but all the way through, where we manage change well, and we do all those things well that we'd expect of a leader at the top of organisation, but where we're communicating well, where they've got visibility and accountability, where we've got trust in leadership. So it's a new leadership competencies really, or a drive towards those competencies that most leaders have, but kind of don't show it in great amounts. So how can we drive that through in our organisations? But we're also seeing a desire from people for more human and more agile organisations. So if you know if you read the reports from the World Health Organization, this won't be the last major disease or pandemic that we perhaps see in our lifetimes. The increase in zoonotic diseases has tripled over the last 40, 50 years. So anything from AIDS all the way through to COVID, all the way through to SARS and all the rest of it, all those different diseases have really emerged over the last 50 to 60 years. So
it is true, you've been stockpiling to the haven't you? And
yeah, and if you listen to people like David Attenborough, he'll say, the deforestation of the planet is bringing us in contact with these kind of things. So being agile as an organisation and dealing with things like the cost of living crisis for our employees means that we have to be more agile as organisations. We have to have leadership which thinks, yes, and we deal with it. We feel, we listen to employees, we're empathetic, and we're adaptive when we do something. We're agile and respond and do that quickly. So the need for the leadership competencies is very much around being more human towards people and being more listening and trusting and but still managing the business in a way that we're taking those views of employees and listening to employees on a more frequent basis.
Amazing. I think leadership is about looking up, not looking down. Yeah. Anyway, right, so key takeaways from our webinar today. So while I'm going through these, have a think about any questions that you have for our mini panel, and then pop them in the Q&A, and then we will come to them in a second. But just to wrap up, that taking the pulse of employee needs has never been more important, that active listening that we talked about. But it's really important that you're doing that at a frequency that works for you. And it's really about asking the right questions. We're really passionate at WorkBuzz that when you are listening, it's about not just looking for the areas that aren't going well, it's about really pulling out those areas to celebrate as well, bringing out the humanness that Ian just talked about, and enabling your leaders through the stories to kind of really use that employee listening for good. Creating meaningful employee experiences that build connection, the moments that matter piece, the bucket. How do we fill people's buckets? There are so many things that we can do, and sometimes it's the tiny little things that make the biggest difference. And in the surveys that I've seen, both across WorkBuzz and across our client base, it always comes down to the little things that make the biggest difference. So how do we better understand what they are so we can intentionally create meaningful moments of connection across our organizations? Connection is key. We have to think about how we offer opportunities in the workplaces, in the hybrid world, in the digital world, to keep people connected. So being creative in how we do that. And the statistics that Steve shared just really showed how important that onboarding experience is. If we get that bit right, then people are much more likely to stay with us, and all of that investment that you put into them right at the beginning of their journey with you is worth it. So if we don't know what's not working, then how can we change it? So let's measure that onboarding experience. Let's work out what's working. Let's define what onboarding actually is and when someone truly is onboarded, and kind of let's build an experience that's kind of really powerful. And then the final piece that I can't see because is around leadership. I couldn't see it because Steve's face is in front of that bit on my screen. But leadership is, it always plays a huge part in any organisation and any culture. And there's never been more pressure on leaders to get this stuff right. But John in our people science team as well uses a really good analogy around a pilot on an aeroplane. You know, you are that steady voice that provides consistency and reassurance that everything's okay. So let's really think about what those leadership competencies are that are needed within our own organisations, and let's really set people up for success. Let's think about making sure that we are giving them the expectations and the capabilities to succeed. And so those are the key takeaways from our research. As Steve said, we're going to be sending the full report through in follow-up to our webinar today. And our lovely team, Emily and Fiona, will be in touch if you want to find out more about any of the specific points within the research. But does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask of Steve and Ian in particular while you have them? Please feel free to pop any questions in the Q&A and we will respond to them. If not, I might just ask you some anyway.
Play nice.
I will be nice. I'm always nice. Steve, from your perspective, because we've done the survey since 2018 in terms of this research, what was the biggest surprise for you this time?
I think in terms of we stay pretty close to our clients. We do regular the best practice forums and calls around that. So we knew talent retention was so important. And I think, I remember speaking to a people director for an engineering company a few months ago. He said to me, it's the first time in 20 years in that sector, talent retention is one of the #1 items on the board agenda. It used to be about sales and great. It's about that key barrier to being successful. I think probably a bit surprising, both Ian and I, with the chip in, it's probably the hybrid working piece. I think in terms of maybe a perception, rightly or wrongly, that we have it cracked now because it's so far laid down. We roll out Zoom or Teams really quickly. Everyone's got laptops. Everyone can connect digitally. But I think we haven't really solved that connection piece. So this is something about WorkBuzz in terms of our culture. That's one of the things I mentioned we need to do more of in the hybrid is how to create those connections on the emotional level, despite that we're in parts of the 3 days a week or so. Is that add?
No, no. The hybrid working, how far that had fell down the list of priorities, I think was not a surprise, but just concerning, because I think that again, hybrid working, people's vision is that we put a process in place and that's it. We've done our job, but you know, down the line in several years, it could come to bite us on the backside. You know, if young people haven't got the skills that perhaps they think they should have, or you know, we see bigger turnover in organisations because people aren't as engaged with the organisation as they could be. So we just need to be aware of that and make sure we're tracking that through. I think the other thing for me is that it just shows the way employee experience is up there as the #1 priority, and culture is the #1 priority, and culture as priorities. It just shows how close now that the employee experience and the customer experience is becoming, the starting to become interlinked. So you know, as I said earlier, the airport is probably the most visual example of that. We've all had, you know, the worries that yes, we can finally go away on our holidays this summer, but look at the queues at the airport when you get there, 4 hours, and the chance that when you land in Spain or Portugal that cases hadn't followed you, they hadn't even got on the plane. So you know, that experience that we have as employees, or the employees are having in some of these organizations, is filtering through, or closely linked now to the customer experience you receive. Things like going into pubs and restaurants, you know, where you order food and it only arrives 3/4 of an hour later because they simply haven't got the staff or enough staff to cook it and put it on your table. Things like that, it is impacting the customer experience. So getting experience right, making sure the culture is right so you retain good people, and recruitments, they're all filtering through into our lives now, as it were.
And we had a question from Andrew, who's on the webinar, and it links to what you're talking about here in terms of the connection between employee experience and other business metrics. So Andrew's question is, given the issues mentioned around zoonotic viruses and deforestation, is there an argument that environmental sustainability is linked to employee experience? And then the second part, could this also be linked to organizational values and being seen as an ethical employer?
Yeah, I think that's the critical point. That again, I'll mention the M word, the millennial generation. They certainly, as a generation, they expect that. They expect you as an employee to be ethical and to have that ethical values. So it's certainly linked to recruitment, and it's certainly linked to how you're viewed as an employer in the wider world. You know, we're seeing that with protests now. You know, people gluing themselves to pavements and roads and all the rest of it. That ethical nature and the sustainability nature of being seen as an employer of choice is really important.
And I think there's a big risk going forward. I think over the last couple of years, HR have sometimes been that bridge between what employees want bottom up and the C-suite wants. And a good example is hybrid working, where I think some of the research we published talks around the drive for embracing hybrid working, the fact the majority of employees that are office-based work in the office 2 or 3 days a week rather than 4 or 5, driven by what the employees' expectations are, and the C-suite in some cases taking that on board or relented because of how much and how candor in the marketplace is. I think there's another opportunity with ESG around this, where employees are wanting and expecting that. One of the risks is with a likely recession is ESG drops further down the agenda. And I think some research that KPMG published a week or so ago, which was around, it was essentially going to be more or deprioritise as boards focus more on hitting the financial targets and obviously different pressures. So I think if you're on the call, I think it's a really important role in your organisation to bridge that gap to your board around, let's not lose sight of things like sort of being a responsible organisation, environmental sustainability. Let's not lose sight of how important diversity and inclusion is. Let's not lose sight of employee well-being, even though sort of even as that focus on the bottom line as it's more difficult in some of the economy.
And let's not forget, I was just going to say, let's not forget that some of this sustainability stuff impacts heavily on some employees. So people like house builders, for example, there's a huge pressure on them at the moment to not just pressure, but legal applications to build more sustainably, to not use greenfield land, to use materials that are better for the planet, less concrete, build houses that are better at retaining heat, etc., etc., and they move away from gas boilers, etc., etc. So in that sector alone, it's not just about being sustainable for employees, it's actually about the very way they build their products and the materials they use, which are being impacted on. And that's true of lots of organizations as well, being more sustainable, you know, aircraft moving to biofuels and stuff like that. So it's really important that you're being seen as a sustainable employer that's moving towards that, to recruit people with you know, groups of people with the same values.
Andrew, I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask another one. Any other questions before we wrap up? We are close to 3 o'clock, I think. So if we have no more questions, then what I will leave you with is just to plug our event one more. Oh, no, we've got one more question. Hang on. Oh, thank you. You're very welcome. So what we want to do is not miss the opportunity to plug our live event one more time. Tuesday, 29th of November, the Placeris Hall, London, or join us virtually, either or. You will actually have to wear a bucket if you come. No, you won't. I'm only joking. But we'd love to see you there. We'll follow up with the research, and if you have any questions, then just email hello@workbuzz.com and we'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you very much for joining us today. We have very much enjoyed it, and we will leave you with that. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.